Okay, I'm going to go straight in. What is Zionism? So I've defined it as Zionism is the idea and practice that the Jews have a right to create and build a Jewish state in Palestine, and that their rights as Jews take absolute precedence over the rights and lives of the indigenous people, Palestinians. I'm going to divide the talk into three parts. And the first part, I want to look at the idea fundamental to Zionism, which is a nationalist idea, that the Jews are an ethnic group. The idea of creating a nation state has usually been built on the construction of an ethnic identity. England for the English, Poland for the Polish, etc. But the Jews are not an ethnic group. Judaism is a religion. It was adopted by many different peoples from many different parts of the Mediterranean and elsewhere, and Jews lived in these countries as Egyptian Jews, Persian Jews, Greek Jews for centuries. Second part, I want to look at anti-Semitism. If you accept that Jews are not an ethnic group, which of course the Israeli state do not, you could argue that a Jewish identity was created out of the anti-Semitism against them. And here it is true that Zionism is a response to anti-Semitism. But it was a particular response at a particular moment of history, which was then infused with a universality, i.e. anti-Semitism now means anti-Semitism always for all Jews everywhere. And of course we have to look at the Holocaust. There is a meeting later today at 3 o'clock devoted to that. We must look at it, the massacre of 6 million Jews and the attempted elimination of European Jewry by the Nazis. Zionism and the creation of a Jewish state was a response to the Holocaust. But I will argue that it is not the response, it is not the answer to anti-Semitism. Thirdly, third part of the talk, I want to look at how Zionism succeeded. How did a settler colonialist project of a small number of people in a time post-World War II when anti-colonialist struggles were succeeding throughout the world, how did they establish a new ethnically defined state? Right, so I want to go back to the first bit, the idea that the Jews are an ethnic group. The idea that the Jews are a people and therefore have some right to their own country was not the way that Jews had been regarded or regarded themselves over previous millennia. Jews followed Judaism as a religion, and the Holy Land and Jerusalem were regarded much as Muslims regard Mecca and Christians regard Bethlehem as holy places for pilgrimage and prayer, but not as a homeland. Jews lived in many lands and regarded those lands as their homeland. But establishing Jews as a nation and forging this link is always called restoration or return, as if it's going back to something. The link between the Jewish people and an ancestral land in Palestine or Canaan is central to Zionism. But what if Jews never came from a place called Israel or Judea? What if they were not exiled, were not dispersed after the fall of the first temple, 6th century BC, or the second temple, 770 CE, and have not been wandering in exile ever since? Evidence gathered by many historians, and this is really essential reading on this, Shlomo Sand, professor of history at Tel Aviv University, The Invention of the Jewish People. It's a fantastic read. Evidence gathered by him, and he draws on many, many disciplines, historians, linguists, archaeologists, even geneticists. That evidence has been quite effectively silenced in Israel to make a religious text, which is not here on the table, you know what it is, the Old Testament, the Bible, fit a nationalist narrative, a modern nationalist narrative. as the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans developed their empires, people around the shores of the Mediterranean came and mixed in these newly expanding cities, trading with each other, mixing with each other. The old gods, these pagan gods, the Greek gods particularly, silly bunch, didn't fit. They didn't fit this mix. You know, how can my gods be right when you've got another god, you've got another? Monotheism fitted. And actually Judaism was the monotheism at the time. And it was a proselytizing religion. They wanted converts. People, you know, became Jews. As with nearly every religion, Jews are Jews by conversion, not by where they were born or their ancestors were born. So its growth was quite prolific around the shores of the Mediterranean, and it is really only halted by the popularity of the next monotheism, Christianity, especially when it became the imperial religion, because obviously it's very handy to have the same religion as your rulers, and you know, you can get jobs and so on. So Christianity sort of put a stop to the spread of Judaism, but there has never been an ethnic identity, an ethnic group of Jews, and the tie to Jerusalem was religious and not ethnic. Later, the Ashkenazi Jews, now the elite class in Israel, came from conversions in another area at another time, from Khazaria. When I brought this up with my mate Nadim at the front, he said, I know about that, but I thought if I said it, you'd say you're talking rubbish. Because people say, oh no, that can't be true, there can't have been this kingdom. There was, right? There's a lot more evidence for the existence of Khazaria. A kingdom lasted 400 years, so there's going to be some evidence really, because we're talking Common Era, not BCE. There's evidence in Hebrew, because the monarchs of Khazaria converted to rabbinical Judaism. The real thing, the kosher thing, they converted to rabbinical Judaism. 400 years of them ruling means there was plenty of time to that to trickle down to the peasants, to the local people, to the community through their kingdom. They had an interest in keeping a separate identity in conversion. They had a material interest, where at Marxism we don't just deal with ideas. Material interest was they've got Byzantium Christianity, they've got Islam coming, and they want to resist. They want, okay, we're Jews. Well, for people of the book, the Arab Islamist conquerors, that was okay. They didn't need to take them over and try and convert them because they were already people of the book. Very handy. So this group, they converted to rabbinical Judaism in 4th century BCE, and the evidence is not just from Hebrew, but also from Arabic, Persian, Russian, Armenian, and even Chinese sources, because it was a big place, and it was right in that, in Southeast Asia. Another way Nadim helped me on the way, he said, was it near Georgia? And I think that's probably about right. Now, let's get back to now. In the late 19th century, Zionism was born. 90% of the entire Jewish population at that time, you know, world Jewry at that time when Zionism was born, were descended from this group, the Ashkenazim, from Khazaria. They lived in the Russian Empire. By that time they lived in the Russian Empire and Poland and had been settled there for centuries. These Jews' ancestors did not come from the Middle East. They did not come from Palestine. I'm a genetic instance of this. My dad's an Ashkenazi Jew. My genetics tell me that's where I came from. And believe me, Israeli geneticists have tried to prove different. Our Jewish ancestors did not come from Palestine. The right to return of world Jewry to modern Israel is based on a construct that is full of myths and direct lies. People who know it's not true, as well as believers who think that the Bible story is true. Okay, so there's more on that, but I think I better get on. I don't know if I have time, but I can't resist, no, I'll quote it later. Right, foundational national myths are typical of any nationalism. Ernest Gellner, who wrote about nationalism in 1983, he said, nations are the artifacts of convictions, loyalties, and solidarities. But Zionism's unique feature is its use of the Bible and its ability to use this religious text to mask the colonial settler nature of the modern Jewish state. it eliminates the rights of indigenous peoples. They're in the Bible, but they don't get good, it's not really their story. They get hammered. And it justifies the wresting the land away from the indigenous peoples. Ben-Gurion, the first president of Israel, said, "The Bible is our identity card, the identity card of the Jewish people, as well as proof of its claim to the land of Israel." Michael Rosen, there's a brilliant poem called The Promised Land, and I don't think I have time to read it, but basically he's saying a Jewish immigrant comes to Palestine and says to a Palestinian person's house, right, that belongs to me, hand it over. And the Palestinian goes, "What? No, I live here, my father lived here, my grandfather, what are you talking about?" And he goes, "Look at the documents." And the Palestinian goes, "Where do I start?" And the guy goes, "Just turn to the page marked Promised Land." And the Palestinian goes, "Are they legal?" He said, "Who wrote them?" "God," they said. "God wrote them. Look, here come his tanks." What a brilliant poem. You should read it all. Anyway. Ben-Gurion was a secular Jew. Most of the founders of the State of Israel were very secular Jews. Later, right. But he used the Bible relentlessly. He had Bible groups. He brought in rabbis. He made sure that he was going to use it well. Tying the Jews as an ethnic group to Palestine, however flawed, and it is completely flawed, as I hope I've begun to show, has helped to lead to the reality, the creation of a Jewish state on Palestinian land. So second part of my talk now, let's look at Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism. Zionism is predicated on the idea that Jews will never be accepted in other lands, so they need their own land. Anti-Semitism has a long history, but it is an inaccurate caricature to say that Jews have always lived as victims of oppression. There have been many times when they had stability and even flourished. However, it is true that at times when societies underwent rapid and unsettling change, partly, especially true as capitalism developed in Christian medieval Europe, and also because of the economic roles they undertook or were forced into. A guy called Abraham Leon has written a brilliant book. He was a young Belgian Jew, he died in Auschwitz. He wrote a brilliant book showing how the Jews fitted into medieval Europe in terms of roles and the exclusivity, what it led them to become. It meant they were a very handy scapegoat. And we know enough looking at our societies now to know how easy it is once you can label a group to scapegoat them. But it was the death throes of the Tsarist Empire which formed the context for the violent, horrendous anti-Semitic pogroms at the end of the 19th century, as the ruling class blamed the Jews for the heightened crisis of the Russian Empire. And these pogroms led to the mass emigration of Jews. There were different responses to the wave of anti-Semitism. First response, get away. Most emigrated. But the promised land they sought was not Palestine. It was America, of course. But listen to these figures. From 1880 to 1929, more than 3 million Jews had quit Eastern Europe for the US and another 500,000 for Western Europe. By contrast, in these 50 years, only 120,000 Jews chose to go to Palestine. Tiny numbers. There was a third option, to stay put and fight for their rights where they were. And I hope I have time to cover some of that. Zionism sprang up amongst other nationalisms in the late 19th century. The idea of peoples needing states was a driving force, especially amongst peoples oppressed by the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman empires. People didn't have their own nation states, they wanted them. Especially the middle classes, developing from capitalism. We know about nationalism, these growing markets, they wanted their own nation states to further their interests as this growing bourgeoisie. There was the French model of citizenship nationalism from the French Revolution, i.e. all citizens belong to the nation. As Gandhi said, the Jews born in France are French Jews, in the same way that Christians born in France are French. And we might add now, the same way Muslims born in France are French. But Zionism followed the German model of ethnic nationalism, promoting the idea of a Volk. All those of a certain race should have their own nation. Zionists, and even what we might term left Zionists, I know there's a problem with that phrase, like Avi Schleim, who isn't on this pile of books, but he will be in other meetings. Avi Schleim is hugely important, Jewish professor, a historian. And to this day, he portrays Zionism as a national liberation movement. So we have to deal with this. The divide between those who want to fight for their rights as part of the fight of rights for all, like people in this room, universal human rights, and those who said this would never happen, the Jews would never gain those rights unless they had their own Jewish state, can be exemplified by two Jews born at the end of the 19th century. You know one of them very well, Trotsky. Some people in the room might know the other one. My father met him, Jabotinsky. They're both from Odessa, both secular actually. Jabotinsky was. It's a multicultural port at the edge of the Russian Empire. Trotsky stood for revolution and an end to all discrimination and racism for all peoples. Jabotinsky stood for using military force, he wasn't stupid, he knew what was needed, to remove the Palestinians and create a Jewish state. At heart, this is a division between the optimism which says we can create societies where people can live together without racism, and the pessimism which casts humanity as eternally racist and anti-Semitic. Socialists know that rulers turn to racism when there's a crisis, to divert anger away from themselves and the real economic causes and onto a vulnerable group, a minority which could be identified and blamed. In those times, when the minority is successfully being victimized, it is understandable. Some decide they can never be safe. People might know about Marcus Garvey. You know, in America, he looked around, he said, they don't want us, look at the racism. If you look at what was in the rally last night, Judith Orr said 542 black people have been shot by police this year. Well, the racism was even worse then. And Garvey said, they don't want us, let's get back to Africa. That was the movement he started. And we know if you marginalise people and scapegoat them, some of them are going to say, we're not wanted here. Okay, we'll go somewhere else. We can see how capitalism uses and abuses minorities. Immigrants are invited in booms and scapegoated and expelled in times of recession. So what were the circumstances in which the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, drew the conclusion that Jews would never be accepted and needed their own national home? What were those circumstances? Well, the Dreyfus case. 1895, in France, a Jewish officer, Dreyfus, was falsely accused of treason. But there was a massive campaign against this. The Dreyfusides, Émile Zola, Jacques, they achieved the acknowledgement of his innocence. Dreyfus himself never became a Zionist. But it was Herzl's disgust at the anti-Semitism of the French military and the governing class, and his disgust at socialist and anarchist and ideas that were coming through. These led him to become a leading advocate and very important advocate of Zionism. But as the 20th century progressed, Jews elsewhere were drawing a different conclusion. In Poland and Lithuania, the socialist labour movement, the Bund, a Jewish socialist party, their slogan was Wir sind da, we are here. A declaration that they were not going anywhere, as if they could. That they would fight for their rights where they were. In Poland, the activists argued that Jews should stay and fight for socialism rather than emigrate. Marek Edelman, some of you may know his book, The Warsaw Ghetto. He was a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto. A Polish Jew who stayed in Poland to the end of his life, never went to Israel. He said, the Bundists did not wait for the Messiah, nor did they plan to leave for Palestine. They believed that Poland was their country, and they fought for a just socialist Poland. in which each nationality would have its own cultural autonomy, and which minority rights would be guaranteed. When the revisionist leader, Jabotinsky, I've mentioned, toured Poland, my father went to one of his talks. Jabotinsky came to Krakow. My father was a Krakowian Jew, at the same meeting with Menachem Begin, by the way. They're both there in Krakow. So Jabotinsky comes. What is he doing touring? He's urging the evacuation of European Jewry. The Bundists accused him of aiding anti-Semitism. Pre-war, Zionists remained a minority. My father was a Polish Zionist Jew, and he used to say the Zionists were middle-class Jews. I don't think he knew the term petty bourgeois nationalist. He had, he probably used it. But they were middle-class Jews who got rich Jews, like the Rothschilds, putting a lot of money into this, to pay for poor Jews to go to Palestine. It was not an attractive prospect. And as we've seen, only a few went. So how did a colonial enterprise of land settlement based on expulsion of native people from that land, how did it happen? Post-World War II. To understand that, we've got to go to the third part of the talk, which is how Zionism's link with imperialism fitted with the imperialist powers, the needs of the great imperialist powers. Look now how minorities around the world, like the Kurds, look for a sponsor. You're not going to get anywhere unless the big guys are on your side. Zionism's tie to imperialism provides the key to its success, not the Bible, in establishing a Jewish state. And the continued support for Israel, what Gada Kami calls their complete impunity, despite its appalling record of illegal acts and horrific war crimes, lies still in this role. It's an ally of US interests. How am I doing for time? Right. Zionists knew that they had to get Palestinian land. And to get it, they had to get the support of the powers that controlled it. So by 1914, that means Britain. The British had a huge empire. The jewel in the crown is India. The route to India, through the Suez Canal. Where's the Suez Canal in the Middle East? So early on, Churchill, Balfour, Sykes, and others in the British ruling class, they make the neat fit between their anti-Semitism, they're all anti-Semites, and the use Jews could be as loyal servants of the British Empire. I have some fantastic quotes, but haven't got time for them, but happy to give them later if you want them. And there were other strands which kind of helped this homeland for the Jews in Palestine become British government policy. The link with English Protestantism and the idea that Jews needed to return to Palestine in order to fulfill prophecies about the return of the Messiah, this sort of Christian Zionism, recently very popular in the US, it would never have achieved such traction if it had not fitted so well with the realpolitik of first the British interest in Suez, and later the American interest in, little word, big interest, oil in the Middle East. And of course Zionism was helped by anti-Arab racism. The Arabs, where their existence was at least noticed, were caricatured as backward, lazy, uncivilized, and really in need of European rule. Hence the British and French justification for their mandates over the Middle East, and the identification of European Jews as a civilizing influence. But really it's about empire here, those ideas secondary. Herzl wrote, England with her possessions in Asia should be most interested in Zionism, for the shortest cut to India is by way of Palestine. England's politicians were the first to recognize colonial expansion, and so I believe in England the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should be easily understood. Chaim Weizmann, who takes over from Herzl and becomes the president of the World Zionist Organization, he wrote that Britain should encourage Jewish settlement, quote, in order to bring back civilization and form an effective guard for the Suez Canal. Lots of other quotes. Churchill agrees, no surprise there. Zionism, as an imperialist ally, has a shocking history. It also has a shocking history of being an active partner of anti-Semites. The logic of Zionism is that Jews must go to Palestine and nowhere else, not to the US, not to the UK, only to Palestine to build the foundation of a Jewish state. All right, little quiz, I can see people here who can answer this one. Who said, as early as 1912, in a speech given in Berlin, quote, "Each country can only absorb a limited number of Jews if she doesn't want disorders in her stomach. Germany already has too many Jews." Any offers? Okay. Weizmann, Chaim Weizmann, chair of the World Zionist Organization in 1912 in Berlin. Even more extreme in this regard is Ben-Gurion, first president of Israel. In 1938, when Roosevelt called the Evian Conference to address the matter of settling Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, for Ben-Gurion, the success of this conference could have been a disaster for Zionism. He said, I mean, how can it be a disaster to save Jews in 1938 when America has called the conference? I'm not saying they meant it, but they called the conference to solve the refugee issue, or tried to, said. So this is Weizmann's response. He said, "If I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England," there was a plan to bring them to England, "and only half of them to Israel," he's calling Israel, "then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of those children, but also the history of the people of Israel." I mean, think of the implications of that. Willing to sacrifice Jewish children to Zionist ideal. But it fits, because he believed, or said he believed, anti-Semitism would go on to the future, so and so on. But at this time, most Jews were not Zionists. He knew they would not choose Palestine, and he preferred, the implication is, you know, it's hard to say, but he preferred that they would die rather than find a safe haven in US or Europe. And he's not alone. There are some American rabbis who voiced that opinion as well. It's the logic, unfortunately, of Zionism, or a logic. In 1938, the Evian Conference actually couldn't suggest Palestine. Why? Because at this time, Palestine is a war zone. Do you know that? Why is that left out of our history books too often? The Arabs had finally revolted against British rule, British mandate after the First World War, Palestine's given to Britain, and the uncontrolled Jewish immigration, which was responsible for taking their land and livelihoods. So they begin the Arab revolt. It began with a general strike. 62 strike leaders are imprisoned. So you get how solid it was. By 1937, when the Arab elite had fled the guerrilla war which was waging throughout the countryside, I just want to say it began with a massive general strike. 62 strike leaders are imprisoned. So you can see the breadth of it there, the depth of it. But by 1937, when the Arab elite had fled the guerrilla war throughout the countryside, Sykes, of Sykes-Picot fame, you know, the ones who drew all the lines, they estimated 30,000 British troops were in Palestine to quell the Arab revolt. That's how big it was. Estimates, well, the estimates are very difficult. There's 5,000 up to 15,000 in some sources. Whatever the exact numbers of the losses in thousands dead, and thousands of refugees, and thousands interned and imprisoned, and there were many hangings. One interesting point is that Arabs carrying arms were hanged in these revolts. The Jews were not, but we'll come back to that maybe. Right, the Jews were helping the British, and the Zionists obviously encouraged this, you know, the Haganah, the Zionist militia. And the Zionists understood that being armed was the key to what they'd have to do to the Palestinians to get their land. But when the Nazi persecution, have I done this bit?
No,
turned into the Holocaust, it looked to many as if Jews settling in Palestine was the answer. The crime had been committed on European soil by Europeans, but the Palestinians were to pay for it. And a combination of circumstances, including the terrorist bombing of the King David's Hotel, killing 40 Brits, and the Zionists' careful lobbying of UNSCOP, the UN organisation charged with overseeing post-war Palestine, which the Arabs boycotted because it was so clearly biased against them, and different incidents like the Exodus, that boat carrying German refugees, which is sent back to Germany, the Palestinians in thousands having been killed by the brutal suppression of the Arab revolt. This led to the UN partition plan, producing a solution which took 55% from the Palestinians, 55% of lands in historic Palestine from the Palestinians, and gave it to Jewish immigrants. In 1947, when the plan was to be implemented, armed Zionists continued to use the terror that had actually been used since 1920s to drive Palestinians off their land. But this time they were highly trained and equipped militarily. Deir Yassin, the massacre of 400 civilians, led by a gang led by Menachem Begin, set the civilian population in fear. And although many men stayed to fight, families fled. The forced expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians, the Nakba, is the precondition for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Since then, Zionism has meant the survival of the Jewish state as Jewish, i.e. not a state for all its citizens. Zionism today is used to justify the way it treats Palestinians, those who remain within Israel, and of course much more so in the occupied territories. All of them are subjected to an apartheid system of rights. Israel denies the dispossession of Palestinians, denies the right of return for refugees still in camps. It's endlessly aggressive, invading every country on its borders, Lebanon many times. It's expansionist, it's building illegal settlements on Palestine, what remains of Palestinian land, and carrying out house demolitions, and of course massacring in the mass invasions of Gaza, and imprisoning people we'd say were children under 16, and denying the rights to a dignified life, defying international laws. Now, why is it, I'm sure I have missed out, it's coming back to that. Right, why is it that it survived? Why does it have this total impunity that Ghada Kami talks about, and others? Why is it no sanctions despite its war crimes? Because Zionism is, and may still be in the future, useful to the US and Europe. The Arab ruling classes have long since accommodated to business as usual. Business with Israel. But the Arab peoples support the struggle for Palestinian liberation against Israel as a violently oppressive Jewish state. There is a built-in instability to the top-heavy, obscenely rich Arab elites and the Arab masses. And we've seen that instability in the Arab Spring. We've seen the rebellion. Only in the Middle East can Israel's population be counted on to be totally loyal to US imperialist interests. My dad's dream was Zionist, and he looked on Israel as the greatest creation of the 20th century. But Zionism is a colonial project and a racist ideology, and Israel is a nightmare for Palestinians, for Arab peoples on its borders, for those who suffer the Israeli arms industry in so many parts of the world, and actually for Jews who don't want to be identified with this level of violence and ethnic cleansing. Zionism is the ideology which continues to bolster Israel as a state based on an exclusive Jewish identity, which excludes and mistreats others from all others from their rights. And for an increasing number of Jews, the vast majority of whom continue to choose in safety outside Israel, Zionism doesn't speak for us. I'm going to stop there, though I think I've missed out some bits.
My name's Mike Waterman from Brighton, and I'm chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign there. For 2 years, from 2012 to 2014, I got to know quite a lot about Zionism by having to confront up to 20 Zionists every Saturday. There was a store, EcoStream, by an Israeli company, SodaStream, that opened a store in Brighton selling goods made in the occupied territories. So we set up a picket every Saturday, try and close it down, stop people buying it. A couple of weeks into it, the Zionists turned up. And not just Jewish Zionists, but a large number of Christian Zionists as well. And they had the Israeli flags, we had our Palestinian flags, we both had banners and placards and all that stuff. And both trying to claim the mantle of anti-racism. They had a big banner saying BDS is racist, anti-Semitic. And we were of course saying that Zionism is racist and racist towards the Arabs. And the way that played out was very interesting because we were part of the anti-racist movement in the city. We had links with the local communities, links with the unions, links with all the different anti-racist organisations. And of course they didn't. I mean, we were left-wing, they were right-wing, and it played out a number of ways. UKIP came down to support them. They targeted our black and Arab members, particularly, and one woman just couldn't stop herself telling the black African to go back home, you know, despite their protestations of anti-racism. And also in Brighton, every year the EDL came, March for England, EDL, important part of it. We were central to that, part of that organisation. And I did hear that a couple of them actually went along to it and were, you know, did say that they were against the EDL. But it's a bit like, you know, the stuff with Golders Green recently when they were going to be there, and we would stand alongside them against the fascists. But their whole politics actually makes it impossible for them to show the sort of unity to really fight racism and fight anti-Semitism.
Just to let people know, I mean, you can speak for up to 3 minutes. When you've had 2 minutes, I'll tap on the table, just so you know. The man at the front, you see?
Just a short one, really. First of all, I wanted to ask the question. Now, Miriam said the first Prime Minister of Israel said the Bible was their identity account. What I wanted to ask is why the Bible and not the Torah? I've heard rabbis saying that, you know, Jews had been exiled from the land, and, you know, it had been promised to them before the exile. Does the Bible not mention the exile, or does it say anything about right to return? If you could clarify a little bit on that. The other thing I want to say is that all three of the religions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, all of them have similarities, lots of similarities, but we're mainly connected because of the monotheistic ideology. And what I wanted to point out was if we had a one-state solution, the proper thing to do would be to give those who believe they have some sort of claim to the Holy Land as a pilgrimage, not to settle, but as a pilgrimage. They should be able to go. They should be able to go there either as a holiday or as a pilgrimage. And, you know, if I, for example, wanted to go and worship in the Aqsa Mosque, I will gladly go there for a short period of time. I will gladly pay a Palestinian rent, either to live in a hotel or in a house. And that's how I think the proper system should be. I don't think any religion has overall 100% entitlement to settle forcibly in that land. Thank you.
The man in the middle there.
Thank you very much for the talk, and my condolences for the stressful nature of that.
I usually don't worry.
No, there were fantastically important elements there to stimulate a good discussion. I think this discussion about Zionism is extraordinarily important. You've seen when we go out and stand in solidarity with Palestinians for their right to self-determination, for their right to their land. We have to be absolutely clear that we are not being anti-Semitic. We're not railing against Jews, and Judaism and Zionism are not synonymous. Zionists would argue that as a shield to protect their colonial settler project in the Holy Land. So the more clear we can be about the history and lineage of Zionism as what was a very small minority ideology amongst Jews prior to the Holocaust, and then became the majority perspective afterwards as a reaction, as a sort of defensive measure. As you said, Marcus Garvey, the Black Star line. Marcus Garvey and the Ku Klux Klan had the same line, which is blacks go back to Africa. If you start agreeing with the racists and the fascists, you have a problem. You'd better check your ideology and your argument. So although there was a lot in what Marcus Garvey said that was powerful about, you know, self-determination and liberation and so forth, the solution was wrong. You know, that's why we would be in favor of a one-state solution as well, is that it's unfortunate and it's horrific injustice that the Zionist project has colonized the Holy Land, but what must happen is that all three of the world's major religions and the people of no faith should all have access to that place. And that's the only sustainable solution. And if we don't differentiate Zionism from Judaism, then you'll have fascists joining Palestine solidarity demonstrations and so on and so forth. The fact that the Palestinian flag was held by the Nazis in London last week broke my heart. We used to have that in New York City on Palestine solidarity demonstrations. We spent the first hour getting the Nazis out of the march. The Star of David does not equal a swastika. The Star of David is associated with the Jewish faith, and the Jewish faith is not synonymous with Zionism. These sort of things are extremely important because Israel, the state of Israel, is a Zionist colonial settler state, and we need to expose that, but we have to have Jews on our side in making that argument if we're ever going to win. Anti-Semitism is going to undermine our ability to win liberation for Palestine, and it's going to undermine our ability to fight racism and fascism, which is absolutely linked with the struggle for liberation.
This is a really brief point, but going back to what the man was saying about the Torah and whether Israel is the promised land for the Jews. I think it is. The actual phrase, the promised land, is actually what it is. It's to do with the covenant between God and Abraham, if you believe that kind of stuff. That when the Messiah comes, the Messiah will come because the world has been fixed, and it is the job of the Jews to fix the world. And when the Messiah comes, then you can return to the land of Israel. And that will be, you know, what the Christian Zionists call the end of days. So this idea that it is the land that God gave to the Jews is a really, really modern thing that only really came about after the creation of the State of Israel. And so before then, nobody even thought that was part of what being a Jew was. And it's also part of the complete destruction of the history throughout Europe and also throughout the rest of the world that has gone on with the State of Israel in recreating an identity for the Jews, which is, you know, a warlike and, you know, very aggressive nation, which has very little to do with the religion. It's completely stamped out the history of the Jews, which this idea of fixing the world, or tikkun, is something which has been used by the Jews as a very kind of as a way of being part of the left, or of being part of an alternative to the ruling class, or by working class Jews throughout history, and that has been totally stamped out with this idea of Jews as being, you know, an aggressive and warlike people, and it's an absolute travesty. And that was what I wanted to say.
Two points. I'll keep both of them brief. The first point is about this question about ideology. It's the whole thing about the notion of creating this notion of the chosen people, the notion of the land, the inheritance, and all the rest of it, is an invention to create kind of a nationalist identity, which is not peculiar to what happens in Israel. I've got a book there at the back there. I just got out the bookshop. and it's about the invention of Ireland. And it's exactly the same process. You know, the notion that Ireland was invented, you know, I don't know if people know about this, but you know, had a whole group of Anglo-Irish intellectuals trying to teach the Irish to speak Gaelic again. It's, you know, you get that kind of process taking part. There's actually a very good writer who talks about this and makes some very funny jokes about people being forced to speak Irish again after being forced to speak English in the first place. But that's the one point. But I wanted to use Ireland because there's a counterpoint to what put the different aspects of nationalism and the different classes that are involved. And there's a direct link. I don't know if anybody knows this, but the British intelligence in Dublin Castle had a gang, a very notorious murderous gang, who went around killing Irish nationalists. And it was called the Cairo Gang, and it wasn't a mistake. The Cairo Gang was called that because these people had been working with British intelligence in Cairo. And these people had trained Zionists to basically attack the Arabs in the 1920s, and things like the Ergun and Stern gang, many of these people have been involved in that and been involved in those kind of tactics and how they learned it. And I think if you look at it, if you try and picture it in your mind, there's the Cairo gang, right? You see the Cairo gang in Ireland acts to attack Irish nationalism, if you like. I mean, it's a crude way of putting it, but you know, that's the image you can do. Then you can look at the Cairo gang. What does it do? It maintains the interests of the Zionists, or encourages the interests of the Zionists, or the aspirations of the Zionists. And that really tells you a lot. It tells you what is the kind of class nature of each of the respective struggles taking place. One is actually to, you know, with all its shortcomings, I'm not going to do a defence of Irish nationalism, a blanket defence of that, but nonetheless, it was a genuine attack on imperialism. It was a movement against British imperialism. There's absolutely no question of that. I'm completely confident to make that statement. When you look at Zionism on the other end, what was its role? Its role in the Middle East was to uphold British imperialism in that region. That was its sole function. That was why it was useful for the British ruling class. That's why the British intelligence were quite happy to bring them on board and actually train them.
I'd just like to say something about nationalism in general, but I say this specifically in Irish nationalism, which, you know, had a progressive aspect to it in that it was anti-imperialist. But subsequent to the establishment of the Irish state, it acted to suppress class struggle. I grew up in this nationalist Ireland where we were all in it together. And as a result, the working class got screwed, and its own identity was wrapped up in this myths that go back hundreds of years, when Ireland existed as an island, not as a nation. And it's only in last recent years that this has begun to break down. So look, it had a progressive aspect to it. It had its time, and its time is long gone. But unfortunately, the melody lingers on.
So I'm going to bring Miriam back in. She can speak for 10 minutes.
Okay, I didn't realize how much time had gone so quickly. Okay, so the gentleman who stayed at the beginning, when you meet Zionists, the level of self-righteousness is almost tangible. And it's because the guy I think who's explained this best to me is a guy called Mark Ellis. He's an American rabbi, and he wrote a book called Out of the Ashes. And he kind of explains that what's happened to Jews is they've taken this history of oppression and being victims, especially at the time of the Holocaust, which was horrendous. You know, there didn't seem to be any answer, and there didn't seem to be any God. Because how could God allow 1 million Jewish children to die? You know, it didn't seem... So this sort of combination of United States Jewry who were dealing with the modern world and all the alienation that goes with that, and the lack of roots as well. It's still the new world. If you met Americans, it's, you know, it's something to deal with. This alienation combined with this idea of being a victim, you know, that this history, that gave them, instead of believing in God who'd done this terrible thing. So Judaism leaves its sort of very religious aspect, and instead the focus becomes on the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are going to carry our identity forward rather than religious. So it becomes much more political, national identity, and focused on, when it's established, on the state of Israel. So what he says, I'd like to quote him because he says it very powerfully. He says, that identity of being innocent in suffering, continues into Israel, innocent in empowerment. They are now a powerful state, a modern nation state backed by America, but they continue with this idea of we are innocent and suffering. The Holocaust was committed in Europe, and the idea that that mindset, in a way, the geography changes to the Middle East, but the mindset doesn't. Anyone who attacks Jews is like Nazis. They're like Hitler. 67 war, that victory is like, if you look at the Israeli press, it's, this time we beat Hitler. It's they've transcribed a situation of Jews that a terrible, terrible nadir of Jewish life in Europe. They've imposed it on a completely different geographical and political landscape. And where are the Palestinians in this? They're nowhere. It's all particularist. It's all about the Jews. So that's why you get this enormous emotional furore. I'm sure people here have been Palestinian, I'm seeing nods. You get this, if you attack me, you're invested with all these horrendous ideologies of Nazism, racism. No, we're not. We just want to say Israel should not exist as an ethnically pure state, of which there are none others. We don't have that in the modern world, based on the expulsion of a people who lived there for centuries. And who actually, even Ben-Gurion in 1928 said, the Palestinians are the descendants of our Jewish, Judean and Sumerian ancestors. They are our brothers and sisters. That's what he said in 28. After the Arab revolt, when the Arabs say, yeah, we are here, we are your brothers and sisters, but actually this is our land, our houses, our children, Ben-Gurion changes his mind, of course, and completely goes towards the Bible. And he takes on the Bible as his way of imposing the right to that land. Where did I get to? Okay, so that's why you get this emotional impact. And the thing is, with the Zionist narrative, it does leave out the Palestinians. At least with Jabotinsky, raging diarist, a Zionist. My dad was a follower of Jabotinsky. After that meeting in Krakow, where, by the way, he said to the Polish audience, no Yiddish to be spoken here. Well, that cut 95% of them out. Basically, that's what people spoke in Poland. But no, they were identified with the Bundists, who wanted to say, we're here in Poland, we want to fight for our rights here. The Zionists, and Jabotinsky said at that meeting, my dad told me, Begin spoke and he said, this is the future. And he spoke in Hebrew. He said, Hebrew is the future. And militarist Zionism is the future. At least Jabotinsky acknowledged there were Palestinians there. He knew that. And he knew they could only be beaten by force. And Herzl's brilliance, and Weizmann's following him, was to tie that idea to British imperialism and post-war to American imperialism. That's how they've succeeded in creating what is meant to be a modern state and is still using the Bible as its title deeds. Nadine brought up this right to return. I don't know where everyone is from in this room. You know, you've probably got people from all over the world where you've got a right to return back to. No, the right to return is written into the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, because if you are made a refugee, you have the right to return. But that's why I spent quite a large part of the talk at the beginning, because these are not people who have originally come from that area of the world. Even if we say the right to return goes back to 2000 BCE, which makes the world a very, you know, I mean, that would be very hot. We'd all be going all over the place, wouldn't we? But as I said, 90% of world Jewry, at the time of the creation of the Israeli state, their ancestors had never come from anywhere in the Middle East, you know, and that is genetically, you know, verifiable. And as to go back to what Nadeem and I were talking on the way here, which is Jerusalem can still count, and does for Orthodox Jews, count as a place of pilgrimage and worship. It doesn't mean you have to go and live there and take it. That's a modern idea, a nationalist idea. Yeah, whether it's imperialist or like, there were many national liberation struggles. Who's the gentleman who spoke about Ireland, Irish nationalism? If you break up imperialism, if your struggle is anti-imperialism, if you are oppressed by imperialism, we support those struggles. The thing that happened with Zionists is they identified the imperialism and said, we'll do your job for you. We'll work for you. And we'll work for you in the Middle East. When Herzl was willing to accept Uganda and places, no, British imperialism wanted them in the Middle East, and then he realised that, and then that combination was hugely powerful. So the idea that it was a national liberation struggle, it cannot be. I think it is useful to look at the Kurds. If you tie yourself with an imperialism, if you do imperialism's bidding, you are going to oppress others. And the appalling record of oppression of the Palestinians is because of that lethal combination. While Israel can do the job of imperialism in the Middle East, it will be backed up to the hilt. In the war on Gaza, it wasn't a war, it was an assault. A massive, massive, full of human atrocity assault on a practically unarmed population. I mean, those rockets are nothing. Now, why is that backed up? Why in the middle of it did the Americans rearm the Israeli state to carry on that assault? Because it's still useful to them in the middle of the Middle East to have a state where the whole population has to stay loyal to them and will do their bidding. Because I think it was Kissinger said years ago, he said the problem with America, it's an island thousands of miles away from mainland Eurasia, where the big markets are, where capitalism grows, where we need to be. Well, you've seen America's tried to get in there, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It can't control it, can it? It doesn't work. It's going to go into Syria soon, with the same disaster, like more bombs are going to give it more power. No, but it can rely on Israel to do the best it can. Maybe Israel hasn't got that power now. I think an interesting discussion is whether actually Zionism and the Israeli state as it stands, as an ethnically defined state, can that help US imperialism? After all, they weren't even invited on board in the coalition of the willing in 1991 war because they knew they couldn't get the Arab states on board if they got Israel. So it could start with the change to the pivot to Asia, China, India. How useful is Israel then? Maybe it still is, because the Straits of Hormuz, they have to stay open. I mean, I'm going to leave it for a question for the audience really. Is Israel, that has been guarding the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, where oil still leaves for the world economy, is it a useful ally to have in the future? Or is it more possibly a liability? The one thing you can say is it will be relied on and can be relied on to do whatever US imperialism wants it to do. I'm not sure whether we got to, please stick up your hand, I can't remember what other, did we deal at all with, I've got here someone saying after the Holocaust. I can't actually remember what was said there. Did we have that discussion? Oh, I am summing up, aren't I? Okay. Is it time? Is that when it's time?
It's fine.
Okay, right, well, I think the problem is I did this meeting before at my branch, so I'm conflicting what was said there with here. But I want to end with the Holocaust, because that is the definitive argument about the state of Israel. A history teacher at my last school, he said to me, but Miriam, if Israel had existed in 1930s and 40s, there wouldn't have been the Holocaust. So, you know, that's the real big argument. Is Israel the answer to anti-Semitism? Has it made Jews in the world safe? I mean, to start with, it hasn't, has it? I mean, the least safe place in the world for Jews is Israel, because it has implanted itself by force and massacre and war crimes on a population which it will not even admit it has dispossessed. So, as a force of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and a force of Zionist, of American imperialism, it is not welcome in the region. So I would argue it is Israel now that is possibly the main focus of what we have of anti-Semitism in the world, because of how it acts, and it acts in the name, it says it acts in the name of Jews. So not only is it not safe for Jews there, it becomes a focus, has become a focus for anti-Semitism, which makes Jews less safe elsewhere, if you want to say. And the main thing about the Holocaust is not to understand it as an attack on Jews. Yes, they were the scapegoat for reasons historically, but we've seen how other minorities can be scapegoated and targeted and treated badly. When we say never again, which we say on demonstrations, never again Auschwitz, never again Treblinka, but we say never again, we don't mean never again just for the Jews. We take the universalist approach. We know it's not, racism isn't particular to the Jews. Racism, modern racism now, is very Islamophobic, with the war on terror. Racism against immigrants, against the Roma, against gypsies. We've always, as socialists, we can see materially that when societies run into trouble, they do pick on a group and try and scapegoat them. But when we say never again, we mean never again for any of those groups that are picked on. Never again for the Roma, never again for Muslims, never again for Jews, never again for any group that is going to be scapegoated by the ruling class. The problem is, many Jews accept that now. There are many Jews in left-wing organisations, many Jews throughout history have taken that lesson, that we are for a society against racism, all racisms. What we still have left is, it should be an anachronism. Zionism is still an ideology which says we are particular because we are the Jews and people are always going to hate us because we are Jewish. And I want to say something which probably doesn't fit, but I've just got to share it because I've only got one chance to do it. I told you my dad was a Polish Jew and he followed Jabotinsky and he was a revisionist Zionist and he never went to Israel. But he did want to, so it's a problem. Most Jews didn't, my dad did, he married my mum and he said, I know my Jews, i.e. she'd never be accepted in Israel. But the Bundists, who said we are here, they didn't win, did they? The Holocaust did happen. But when they were fighting for rights in Poland, they joined forces. The Bundists joined forces with the Polish Socialist Party in the elections in 1933. What did they call themselves? This group who said, yes, we're Jews, but we're socialists, we're going to fight fascism together. With the Polish Socialist Party. They called themselves, I like this, Socialist Worker List. But their politics were really good. They said we can't fight our oppression without the working class fighting together. 1938, things have changed, and anti-Semitism is on the increase. By 1938, it's harder to fight, but they still formed an alliance with the Polish Socialist Party, but they're up against, by now, quite racist parties. We can see here those trajectories. We can see that the future can either be we fight together against our ruling class, against capitalism, or we can identify minorities and blame them and scapegoat them. But we know it's not an eternal, it's a dialectic, it's a struggle. Zionism is so pessimistic. It says anti-Semitism is for always. It's just, you can see throughout history that just isn't true. I want to say one last thing. Which is the group who Jews lived with most throughout the centuries in peace and harmony? It was Muslims. It was Muslims. So when we say, another thing Nadeem said to me on the way here, people say if I say one state, that's idealist. No, it's not. I think with Garda Kami, I think there is one state already. Are you telling me since 1967 it's still occupied territories? We're nearly 50 years. They've got one state. They've basically annexed it already.
Yes.
And the Palestinians are there. Muslims, fewer Christians, and the Jews, they're there. History shows us they can live together in peace and harmony. Now the battle within that one state is not just against occupation, it's for a one-state, secular, democratic, which treats all its citizens as in other modern states. And that is what we need to fight for.